Hey, what's up guys? So can you game on a 2017 15-inch MacBook Pro? Today we're going to try out some games and put it through its paces. So here we go. Alright guys, so first of all, this is a review from a gaming standpoint. If you want to see a full review of the device, I'll put a card up here and a link down in the description to a review that I did just a few days ago. All the games that we're trying out are 1920 by 1200, which is the right aspect ratio for the built-in display on the MacBook Pro 15-inch. It's as close as I could get to 1080p, but still keeping the resolution of the built-in display, which I wanted to capture that. A lot of the games, most of the games I tried on Windows only because there is no Mac equivalent. But there's two games, Subnautica and 7 Days to Die, that I tried in both Windows and Mac OS, just to show you a comparison between the two. The version of Windows that I'm using is Windows 10, and it's installed via Boot Camp on the internal hard drive of the MacBook Pro, and the version of OS 10 that I'm using is OS 10 Sierra with all the latest updates as of July 28th, 2017. So let's get into the games. All right, so the first game we're going to look at is 7 Days to Die. Again, the resolution on this was 1920 by 1200, and I tried it at high, medium, and low in both Windows 10 and Mac OS X Sierra. So at high setting in Windows 10, I was getting about 20 frames per second. The same setting on Sierra was 15 frames per second. And these are averages. This wasn't a constant frame rate. The next up is medium settings, and I didn't mess with any of the other settings, I just chose the defaults on here. So medium was 25 frames per second on Windows 10, and it was close on Mac OS, it was 23 frames per second. But I did notice when I was in Sierra that the fan ran pretty much all the time, where I didn't notice that in Windows. And then on the low setting, which looks pretty bad, but I got really good frame rates on Windows 10, it was 65 to 75 frames per second, and then there was a significant difference on Sierra, which was 40 to 45 frames per second. So, you know, we're talking 20 to 30 frames less in Sierra than in Windows 10. So the next one we're going to look at, I also tried in both operating systems, which is Subnautica. I tried this on the highest, the recommended, and the minimum settings. So in Windows 10 at highest, I got a pretty consistent 50 frames per second, so it was really playable. And then on the Sierra side, I was getting about 35 frames per second, which was still playable, but not as enjoyable. The recommended setting was 55 to 60 frames per second on Windows 10, and right around 40 in Sierra. The minimum settings, I got a pretty consistent 60 frames per second in Windows 10 and about 50 frames per second in Sierra. And the nice thing about Subnautica is that even at the minimum settings, it still looks pretty decent. So for the next set of games we're going to look at, there was no Mac equivalent for these games. They're Windows only, so these are all going to be Windows frames. And again, it's Windows 10 loaded through Boot Camp on the internal hard drive. So next on the list is Just Cause 3. Tried this at very high, high, and medium settings. At very high, I was getting about 40 frames per second. At the high settings, it was about 45 frames per second. And at medium, I was getting right around 50 frames per second. So really at all of those, it's playable. You're not going to get above 60, but you know, even at the 40 frames, it was still very playable. Now on to Fallout 4. This actually really surprised me because at the 1920 by 1200 resolution Ultra, I was getting about 40 frames per second, and it was actually a really enjoyable experience. I didn't see a lot of slowdowns. When you got into some heated battles, it would drop below that and you'd start seeing some stuttering. But even at Ultra, this game actually played pretty well. At the high setting, I was getting right around 45 frames per second, and I didn't see the dipping to the sub 30 frames very often. And then at medium, it was a pretty consistent 55 frames per second. It would drop a little bit, but it was still around 45 to 50. So I never really saw too much lag or anything. So Fallout 4 is really an enjoyable experience on this laptop, actually. So next up is Battlefield 1. So I tried it at ultra, high, medium, and low settings. At ultra settings, it was about 40 frames per second, but I did see some dipping down into the sub 30 frames. At high settings, it was pretty consistent 45. There was some dipping, but it wasn't too bad. Medium, I got a pretty solid 60 frames per second with very little dipping down to the sub 30 frames, so I did not see much stuttering at the medium level. And then low level is 65 frames per second. I saw a little fluctuation with that, but again, at the low level, it was the smoothest, but then, you lose a lot of effects. But all in all, I would say Battlefield 1 was a pretty enjoyable experience on this machine. All right, guys, so in conclusion, I would say if you're buying this MacBook already for other purposes, it's actually pretty capable at playing games. I would recommend that you load Windows on a boot camp partition and play the games in that rather than trying to play them on Sierra, because there was a much better performance in Windows. So if you're buying the MacBook Pro 2017 15-inch for other reasons and you want to play games, it's actually pretty capable at playing games. If you're looking for a machine and your primary purpose is to play games, do not get this laptop. You would be much better off buying a Windows-based laptop. You can get one that performs much, much better in 3D rendering and that kind of stuff, and especially games. That's probably about half the price of this machine. So if your primary purpose is games, don't buy this MacBook. Look at a Windows-based machine. If you're buying one already for other purposes, then you'll be able to play a bunch of these games. And again, I didn't try a lot of games. I tried just a few, but I figured it was enough to give you an idea of how it performs. So hopefully you guys found this informative and useful. If you liked the video, hit the like button below. Please rate, leave comments, and subscribe if you want to see more technical reviews and tutorials that I'll have coming up. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll see you next time.